On behalf of our family, we want to thank all of you for the prayers for our beloved.
January 31st, 2026, 9:48 in the evening. A car pulls up to a quiet home in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood just outside Tucson, Arizona. The night air is cold and still. A woman steps out of the vehicle, walks toward her front door, and within moments the garage door closes behind her. The car drives away, and to the outside world, everything looks completely normal. By the following afternoon, that same home would be surrounded by law enforcement vehicles. K-9 units would be combing the property. FBI agents would be processing a crime scene, and the woman who had walked through that door just hours earlier was gone. Not gone in the way people sometimes disappear. Not gone because she wandered off or forgot where she was, or decided to take an unplanned trip somewhere. Gone in a way that sent shockwaves through a community, through a family, and through an entire nation that watched the story unfold in real time. Gone in a way that led investigators to make a statement that stopped everyone cold. The sheriff of Pima County stood before cameras and said words that nobody expected. Words that suggested this case was far more layered, far more calculated, and far more disturbing than the public had been led to believe. This is the story of Nancy Guthrie, a woman who lived quietly in the Arizona desert for over 5 decades. A woman whose disappearance became one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in recent American history. A woman whose family stood before cameras with trembling voices, pleading for answers that, at the time of this recording, had still not come. And this is the story of a case that, the more investigators dug into it, the less it appeared to be what anyone initially assumed. If you are new to True Crime Vault, welcome. This channel exists to give real cases the serious, in-depth treatment they deserve. We do not chase shock value. We follow evidence. We follow facts. We follow the human stories behind the headlines. If that is the kind of investigative content you want to see, make sure you subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new investigation. We release new cases every single week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming next. And if this case already has you leaning forward, go ahead and hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds and it helps more people find stories like this one. Now let us get into it. Nancy Long Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky. She grew up in a different era, a time when communities were tighter, when neighbors knew each other by name, when the rhythms of daily life were slower and more predictable. She carried with her, by all accounts, the kind of quiet strength that people who live through real hardship tend to develop over time. The kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not ask for recognition, but that is visible in the way a person navigates difficulty, in the way they show up for the people they love, in the way they build a life year after year regardless of what that life throws at them. She married Charles Guthrie, and together they built a family and a home. In the early 1970s, the Guthrie family made the decision to relocate to the Tucson area. Nancy was young then, her children were young, and the desert community of southern Arizona became the backdrop against which the rest of her life would unfold. She put down roots there that would span more than 5 decades. More than 50 years of history in one place. More than 50 years of neighbors and church friends and familiar streets and grocery store clerks who knew her name. Life brought its difficulties, as it always does. In 1988, Charles Guthrie died while on a mining exploration trip in Mexico. He was 49 years old. Nancy was left to navigate the rest of her life as a widow, raising her children, managing her household, building her future without the partner she had made that future with. By all accounts, she did so with grace and determination. She did not retreat from her community. She remained active, engaged, present. She was a regular churchgoer, someone who showed up Sunday after Sunday, who was known and loved by her congregation. She was described by those who knew her as mentally sharp, independent, and deeply connected to the people around her. She had 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. If the name Savannah Guthrie sounds familiar to you, it should. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most recognizable faces in American broadcast journalism. She has been a co-anchor of NBC's Today Show for over a decade. She has moderated presidential debates. She has covered major national and international events. She is a household name in a country where household names in journalism are increasingly rare. And the fact that it was her mother at the center of this case is part of what gave the story its extraordinary national visibility from the very first day. This was not simply a missing persons case out of Tucson, Arizona. This was a story that immediately connected to a face millions of Americans saw every morning over their coffee, which meant that the story was going to reach corners of the country and corners of the media landscape that most missing persons cases never reach. But before we talk about what happened, we need to understand who Nancy Guthrie was as a person in her daily life, because that context matters enormously to what investigators later discovered. And it matters because Nancy deserves to be understood as a full human being before we begin talking about the circumstances of her disappearance. Nancy lived alone in her home in the Catalina Foothills, a residential area situated in the foothills of the Santa Catalina Mountains just northeast of Tucson. The Catalina Foothills is the kind of neighborhood where people know their neighbors, where the streets are quiet in the evenings, where the mountain views are stunning and the pace of life reflects the desert landscape, unhurried and expansive. For an elderly woman living independently, it was a community well suited to the life she had built. Her home was her domain. Her routine was her own. She came and went as she chose, took Ubers when she needed to travel, kept up with her church community, and maintained the independence that, according to her family, was central to who she was. However, there are important details about her physical condition in early 2026 that would later become highly significant to the investigation. Nancy had limited mobility. Investigators and law enforcement officials would later state publicly, with striking specificity, that she could not walk 50 yards on her own without assistance. Let that sink in for a moment. 50 yards. That is roughly the length of half a football field. She could not manage that distance unassisted. She relied on daily medication for a chronic health condition, medication that she required consistently and that she could not simply go without. And she had a pacemaker, a medical device implanted in the body to monitor and regulate heart rhythm, and one that in modern configurations connects to a digital application on the patient's smartphone, allowing the device's performance to be monitored remotely. These details matter in ways that are both obvious and subtle. They matter obviously because they establish that Nancy Guthrie was a physically vulnerable person who could not have left her home independently under her own power in any meaningful way. They matter subtly because they tell us something about the kind of knowledge that would have been required to plan what investigators believe happened that night. Someone who took Nancy from her home either knew about her limitations before they arrived, or they discovered those limitations upon arriving. Either way, those limitations shaped what the night looked like and how it unfolded. The day of January 31st, 2026 appeared to be completely normal for Nancy Guthrie. She woke up in her home in the Catalina Foothills, presumably went about her day as she typically would, and in the late afternoon, at 5:32, she did something unremarkable. She took an Uber to her daughter Annie's home for dinner. This was a routine kind of thing. Family time, a meal together. The kind of evening that happens in families everywhere, every day. An elderly mother visiting her daughter and son-in-law for dinner. Nothing about that evening, by any account available, appeared unusual. Dinner concluded, and at 9:48 in the evening, Nancy was driven home by her son-in-law, Annie's husband, a man named Tommaso Cioni. He dropped her off at her residence in the Catalina Foothills. At 9:50 p.m., security systems registered the closing of the garage door. Tommaso reportedly drove away at that time. Nancy Guthrie was home. She was, as far as anyone in the world knew, safe for the night. That is the last confirmed moment anyone saw Nancy Guthrie alive. What happened next, in the early hours of that Sunday morning, is something that investigators have been piecing together through a combination of digital forensics, physical evidence, and the meticulous reconstruction of a timeline that raises questions which, when you sit with them long enough, become deeply and genuinely unsettling. The window of time that investigators focused on begins at 1:47 in the morning and extends to approximately 2:28, a window of 41 minutes. In those 41 minutes, several things happened in sequence at Nancy Guthrie's home that, taken individually, might have innocent explanations. Taken together, they paint a picture that investigators described as consistent with a deliberate, planned operation. At 1:47 in the morning, a doorbell camera at Nancy's home disconnected, not turned off, not placed into a sleep mode or a lower power state, disconnected. The camera stopped functioning and stopped recording at that moment. At 2:12 in the morning, approximately 25 minutes later, Software on another camera at the property detected movement on the premises, but there was no video available from that detection. The camera registered that something was there. It registered motion, but it did not capture an image. Something had been done to compromise that camera's recording capability while leaving its motion detection active, or the situation had been arranged in such a way that produced exactly that outcome. And then, at 2:28 in the morning, the application connected to Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from her phone. Think carefully about what that sequence means when you read it in order. The first camera goes offline at 1:47. A movement is detected by a second camera at 2:12, but no footage is available. The pacemaker app disconnects from the phone at 2:28. 3 distinct technological events spanning 41 minutes, all centered on the property where a physically vulnerable elderly woman was sleeping alone. The pacemaker app disconnection is a detail that deserves particular attention, because it is the kind of detail that people who are not familiar with how these medical monitoring systems work might not fully appreciate. Modern pacemakers communicate with a companion application on the patient's smartphone. That application monitors device performance, tracks data, and in many configurations can communicate information to the patient's cardiologist. The connection between the pacemaker device and the phone application typically maintains itself automatically when the phone and the device are in proximity. For that connection to sever at 2:28 in the morning, something changed. Either the phone was moved out of range, or the phone was turned off, or something else occurred that broke that digital link. At 2:28 in the morning, 41 minutes after the first camera disconnected, 16 minutes after movement was detected on the property without any corresponding footage. By the time the sun rose on Sunday, February 1st, Nancy Guthrie was gone. She did not appear for a scheduled church service that morning. This was not a casual or occasional commitment for Nancy. This was her church, her community, her routine. She went every Sunday. So when she did not appear, the people who knew her noticed immediately. A member of her congregation contacted her family to report that she had not shown up, expressing concern because this was simply not something Nancy did. Around 11 in the morning, relatives went to her home to check on her. They searched the house. They searched the surrounding property. There was no sign of her, no note, no indication she had left voluntarily. Her phone was still inside the home. Her other essential personal belongings were still there. She had not packed anything. She had not taken anything with her that would suggest a planned departure of any kind. And critically, the doorbell camera had been physically removed from its mounting. Not just disconnected, removed, gone. At 12:03 in the afternoon, the family called 911. 12 minutes later, deputies from the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived at the residence. What they found inside the home led them almost immediately to treat the situation not as a missing persons case, but as something far more serious. And the speed with which law enforcement escalated their assessment is itself significant. When you have decades of experience responding to missing persons cases, when you have a trained professional eye that has seen these situations in all their variations, the moment you walk into a scene and the circumstances tell you immediately and unambiguously that something is wrong here, that this is not what it initially appeared to be, that assessment tends to be accurate. Officials who responded to the scene described the conditions inside the home as, using their own word, very concerning. They noted that what they observed was inconsistent with a voluntary disappearance. The evidence they recovered from inside the residence indicated, in their assessment, that a crime had taken place within that house. Homicide investigators were brought in alongside the deputies conducting the initial search efforts. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos addressed the media and made a statement that immediately shifted the public understanding of what was happening. He said, quoting him directly, "At this point, investigators believe she was taken from her home against her will, possibly in the middle of the night. Taken against her will includes possible kidnapping or abduction. She couldn't walk 50 yards by herself." He told CBS News directly that he believed Nancy had been abducted. Abducted from a residential home in the middle of the night. An elderly woman with severe mobility limitations who had been alone since just before 10 o'clock the previous evening. The word abducted carries an enormous weight in the context of a woman who, by the sheriff's own statement, could not walk 50 yards without assistance. Abduction does not happen passively. Abduction requires action. It requires someone to be present, to take a person, and to remove them from the place where they were. For a woman with Nancy's mobility limitations, that removal would have required physical assistance of some kind. It could not have happened quickly or quietly in the way that some abductions do. It required time and effort and the deliberate movement of a person who could not simply be grabbed and run with. The case formally shifted from a search to a criminal investigation on February 2nd. The Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the Pima County Sheriff's Department. U.S. Customs and Border Protection provided assistance. Search and rescue teams, K-9 units, drones, and aerial resources were deployed across the area. The investigation became one of the most intensive law enforcement operations the Tucson area had seen in years, and that scope reflected the seriousness with which every agency involved was treating what the evidence told them. And then the forensic evidence started coming back. Investigators confirmed that bloodstains had been found at or near the entrance of Nancy's home. Forensic testing was conducted on those samples, and the results were unambiguous. The DNA collected at the scene belonged to Nancy Guthrie. Video footage captured by media outlets stationed outside the home in the days following her disappearance appeared to show what could be described as a trail near the front door. Officials declined to comment on the extent of any injuries or the quantity of evidence found. But the confirmation of her DNA at the scene in that context told investigators something critical about what had occurred inside that house in the hours between Nancy walking through her garage door and her family arriving to find her missing. The doorbell camera had not simply gone offline. It had been physically removed from the property. That distinction is enormously important. A camera that goes offline due to a power outage, or a Wi-Fi disruption, or a technical malfunction is a camera that can be restored and potentially still contains stored footage. A camera that has been physically removed from its mounting is a camera that someone took. Someone who came to that property, identified the location of the camera, reached it, unmounted it, and took it with them. That is not an accident. That is not a malfunction. That is an intentional act performed by a person who was physically present at that home. When you combine the removal of the camera with the sequential disconnection of the other surveillance systems, the movement detected without corresponding footage, and the disconnection of the pacemaker application in that narrow window of time, what you are looking at is a series of deliberate actions. Someone who came to that house in the middle of the night knew about the surveillance systems, knew where they were, knew how to address them, whether by physical removal, by technical disruption, or by some other means that produced the outcome of no usable footage. And they did all of this in a window of 41 minutes before the pacemaker app went offline. This level of preparation is not consistent with an impulsive act. This is consistent with planning, reconnaissance, someone who had either been to that property before and noted the camera locations, or someone who had been given that information by someone who had. Now we need to talk about the ransom notes, because this is where the case takes a turn that added an entirely new and deeply complex layer to an already extraordinary situation. And it is also where the investigation became considerably more complicated, for reasons that will become clear. In the days following Nancy's disappearance, multiple ransom notes began to surface. And here is the detail that immediately strikes anyone who has studied kidnapping cases in any depth. They were not sent to Nancy's family. They were sent to media organizations. On February 2nd, Cold TV, a CBS affiliate based in Tucson, reported that it had received a letter demanding payment for Nancy Guthrie's release. CBS News reported that investigators reviewed the letter, took it seriously, and shared it with the FBI. Law enforcement declined to confirm publicly whether the letter had been sent by someone actually holding Nancy. But notably, and this is the detail that investigators found significant enough to specifically request not be disclosed publicly, the note was said to contain specific details about Nancy's home and about what she was wearing on the night she disappeared. Think about what that means. Not general details. Not information that could be found online or guessed at. Specific details. Details about the interior of the home, or about the specific clothing she had on that night. Details that in theory should only be known to someone who was present at the scene. That level of specificity is what separated this note, in investigators' initial assessment, from the category of opportunistic hoax and placed it in the category of something that deserved serious attention. The following day, TMZ reported that it had received an alleged ransom note demanding millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The note reportedly included a specific cryptocurrency wallet address and a deadline for payment. A cryptocurrency demand in a kidnapping case is notable for several reasons. It speaks to a level of technological awareness that is not universal across criminal actors. It speaks to a desire for anonymity in the financial transaction. And it speaks to a certain confidence that the family both has access to the kind of liquidity required and is willing to use it. On February 5th, Harvey Levin, the founder of TMZ, stated publicly that he had received another communication, one that claimed Nancy Guthrie was still alive, that she was frightened, and that she was aware of the demands being made. That same communication allegedly stated that this would be their only communication. Levin himself emphasized repeatedly that he and his staff were deeply uncertain about the validity of what he had received and were not in a position to confirm its authenticity. The Pima County Sheriff's Department acknowledged publicly that it was aware of reports concerning the ransom notes and stated that all materials and tips were being forwarded to detectives working in coordination with the FBI. And then on February 5th, something happened that dramatically complicated an already complicated picture. A man from California was arrested on federal charges. The allegation was that he had posed as an abductor and had attempted to demand ransom from the Guthrie family. Authorities were clear that this scheme appeared to be entirely unrelated to the other ransom demands that had received significant public attention. In other words, there was at minimum one individual out there who, upon seeing the national profile of this case, upon recognizing that this family was publicly desperate and publicly committed to paying for Nancy's return, decided to attempt to exploit that desperation for personal financial gain. This kind of predatory behavior in the context of a high-profile kidnapping case is unfortunately not unprecedented. When a case generates enormous public attention, when a family is visibly anguished and visibly has the resources to potentially meet a demand, it creates an opening that certain criminal actors will attempt to exploit. And the damage that exploitation causes is not merely financial, it is investigative. Every resource dedicated to evaluating a fraudulent communication, every hour spent determining that a note or a contact is not from the actual perpetrator, is an hour and a resource that cannot simultaneously be spent on the legitimate threads of the investigation. The California man's arrest was a resolution of one thread, but his scheme had already consumed investigative time and energy that the case could not afford to lose. The question of whether any of the ransom communications were genuine, and if so, which ones, remained an open question at the time this was recorded. Law enforcement had not publicly confirmed the authenticity of any of the notes, which is a standard investigative posture. You do not confirm the authenticity of evidence in an active criminal investigation because doing so could compromise the investigation itself, could tip off perpetrators about what you know and how you know it, and could potentially put a victim at greater risk. On February 7th, Savannah Guthrie and her siblings released a video that would be seen by millions of people within hours of its posting. In the video, Savannah spoke directly to whoever was responsible for her mother's disappearance. She said, and I am quoting her directly, "We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us and we will pay. We will pay." The family of one of the most recognizable journalists in America, standing on camera, publicly committing to meeting a financial demand in exchange for their mother's safe return. The gravity of that moment, when you sit with it, is almost impossible to fully articulate. That is a family that has exhausted every other option. That is a family that has been in communication with law enforcement, that has been advised by experts, that has considered every angle, and that has arrived at the point where they are willing to make that commitment publicly because they believe it is the only path that leads their mother home. The following day, reports emerged that the ransom demand stood at $6 million and that there was a deadline, 5 o'clock in the afternoon on February 9th, 2026. To put that figure in context, $6 million is a substantial sum even for a family of means. It is the kind of figure that does not suggest a randomly selected target. It suggests someone who had done their homework, someone who had assessed the financial capacity of the family, who understood that Savannah Guthrie was a prominent and presumably well-compensated television personality, and who structured a demand at a level they believed the family could actually meet. Whether that assessment was accurate, whether the family had access to that kind of liquidity in the time frame required, are questions that were playing out privately even as the public timeline moved toward that February 9th deadline. Now let us look more carefully at the investigation itself, because there are several threads here that are critical to understanding what the sheriff meant when he made that statement, and why the suggestion that this case is not what it seems carries such weight when you examine the full picture of what investigators were working with. The search of the Cioni home is a fact that has to be examined carefully and responsibly. Tommaso Cioni is Annie Guthrie's husband. He is Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law. He was, according to the official timeline released by authorities, the last known person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. He dropped her off at her home at 9:48 in the evening. At 9:50, the garage door closed. He reportedly drove away. In the course of the investigation, law enforcement conducted a search of the home that Annie and Tommaso Cioni shared. It is absolutely critical to state clearly and directly that no charges have been filed against Tommaso Cioni in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. He has not been publicly named as a suspect by law enforcement. Searching the home of family members is a standard and expected part of any investigation into a missing persons case, particularly one that has been elevated to the level of a criminal investigation. Investigators search the homes of people who are connected to a victim because in the majority of cases where a person is taken or harmed, the perpetrator is known to them. This is a statistical reality of criminal investigation, not an accusation against any specific individual. The search of the Cioni home, on its own, does not tell us that law enforcement considered Tommaso Cioni a suspect. It tells us that law enforcement was doing their job thoroughly and leaving no stone unturned. But it is a fact, and it exists alongside the fact that he was the last known person to see Nancy. And any honest, serious analysis of this case has to sit with those facts and acknowledge the questions they naturally generate, while being crystal clear that questions are not accusations and an investigation is not a verdict. Who knew Nancy's routines? Who knew what time she typically arrived home? Who knew that she took an Uber to Annie's house that evening and that Tommaso was the one who would be bringing her home? Who had the kind of access to information about her daily life, her home's layout, her surveillance systems, that would be required to execute what investigators believe happened that night? These are questions investigators would have been asking from the very first day. And the process of answering them involves looking carefully at everyone in Nancy's life, everyone who had contact with her in the period before her disappearance, and everyone who might have had either the motive or the means to plan something of this complexity. The digital forensics dimension of this case is one that deserves its own careful examination, because in 2026, our digital footprints are extraordinarily detailed, and investigators working a case of this profile would have had access to resources and expertise that make the analysis of those footprints remarkably thorough. The doorbell camera disconnection at 1:47 in the morning would have generated a log entry. The motion detection event at 2:12 would have generated a log entry. The pacemaker app disconnection at 2:28 would have generated data that could potentially be analyzed for additional context. Phone records, both Nancy's and those of anyone who had been in contact with her in the days and weeks before her disappearance, would have been subpoenaed. Cell tower data, which can establish the approximate location of a phone at any given time, would have been examined. Financial records looking for anything unusual in the transactions of people connected to Nancy would have been pulled. Uber records from that evening, confirming the timeline of Nancy's movements on January 31st, would have been obtained. In modern criminal investigations, digital evidence is often more reliable and more detailed than witness testimony, and it is frequently the thread that unravels everything. The specific cryptocurrency wallet address that reportedly appeared in one of the ransom notes would have been tracked by FBI analysts with expertise in blockchain forensics. Cryptocurrency is not as anonymous as perpetrators sometimes believe it to be. Every transaction on a blockchain is recorded permanently and publicly. The challenge is connecting wallet addresses to real-world identities, but that challenge is not insurmountable. And law enforcement has demonstrated repeatedly in high-profile cases that it can be done. The communications sent to media organizations are also a fascinating dimension of this case from an investigative standpoint. Every piece of written communication contains potential forensic evidence. Physical notes can be analyzed for fingerprints, for DNA, for the specific characteristics of paper and ink that can sometimes be traced to a specific source. Digital communications contain metadata that can reveal information about the device used, the location from which the communication was sent, and the timing of its creation. When you send a ransom note to a television station or to a media organization like TMZ, you are taking a risk because those organizations are going to hand those communications to law enforcement, and law enforcement is going to process them with every forensic tool at their disposal. The decision to send those notes to the media rather than directly to the family suggests several possible lines of thinking on the part of whoever sent them. It could reflect a desire to create public pressure, to ensure that the story remained in the news and that the family could not quietly resolve the situation without anyone knowing. It could reflect an attempt to use the media as an intermediary to create a channel of communication that felt safer than direct contact with the family. It could reflect an awareness that the family's communications were likely being monitored by law enforcement and a belief that going through the media offered a degree of separation from that monitoring. Or it could reflect a strategic calculation about how to maximize leverage, using the public nature of Savannah Guthrie's profile to ensure that the pressure on the family was as intense as possible. None of these interpretations require the notes to have been sent by someone who is actually holding Nancy. They are equally consistent with someone who read about the case in the news and decided to take advantage of the situation, which is exactly what the California man who was arrested had allegedly attempted to do. The authenticity question is one that investigators had to resolve for each communication individually, and the public record as of the time of this recording does not tell us definitively how many, if any, of the communications were determined to be genuine. The Tucson setting of this case is worth understanding in some depth, because the geography and the demographics of that region are relevant to how an investigation of this kind unfolds and what challenges it presents. Tucson, Arizona sits in the Sonoran Desert, roughly 60 miles north of the U.S.-Mexico border. The city and its surrounding communities are home to more than 1 million people in the broader metropolitan area. The Catalina Foothills, where Nancy lived, is an unincorporated community that falls under the jurisdiction of Pima County rather than the city of Tucson itself, which is why it was the Pima County Sheriff's Department, rather than the Tucson Police Department, that had primary jurisdiction over the investigation. The proximity to the border is something that investigators would have been acutely aware of. In kidnapping cases in the Southwest, particularly those involving ransom demands, the possibility that a victim has been moved across the border into Mexico is a scenario that law enforcement always has to consider and prepare for. The involvement of U.S. Customs and Border Protection in the search for Nancy Guthrie, from the very early stages of the investigation, reflects that awareness. CBP has resources, technology, and jurisdiction that are uniquely suited to monitoring and controlling movement across that border, and their early inclusion in the investigation suggests that law enforcement was not ruling out any geographic possibility. The desert terrain of the region presents its own challenges for a search operation. The Sonoran Desert is a vast and in many areas inhospitable landscape, one where evidence can be difficult to find, where the elements can rapidly destroy or obscure physical traces of human presence, and where a person could, in theory, be taken to a location that is genuinely remote and difficult to search. The K-9 units, the drones, the aerial resources, all of the tools deployed in the initial search were well suited to this kind of terrain. But terrain is terrain, and when someone does not want to be found, the desert offers considerable cover. The national attention that this case received almost immediately from the moment it became public is something that requires its own examination, because the dynamics of how a case of this profile plays out in the media environment of 2026 are genuinely different from how even a high-profile case would have played out a decade earlier. Social media created a situation in which information, real and fabricated, spread in real time to millions of people simultaneously. The ransom notes sent to TMZ were publicly reported within hours of being received. Harvey Levin's statements about the communications he claimed to have received were broadcast to TMZ's enormous audience almost immediately. Every detail that emerged about the investigation, every family statement, every law enforcement press conference, was immediately amplified across platforms and discussed, analyzed, and speculated upon by a public that had genuine emotional investment in the outcome. This creates both opportunities and complications for investigators. The opportunity is that this level of public attention generates an enormous volume of potential tips and witness reports. Someone who saw something relevant, someone who noticed something unusual in the neighborhood on the night of January 31st, someone who has information they did not realize was relevant until they started seeing the details of the case in the news. All of those people are more likely to come forward in a high-profile case than in a case that receives minimal media coverage. The more people who are aware of a case, the larger the potential witness pool. The complication is that this level of attention also generates an enormous volume of noise, false tips, opportunistic communications, people who are genuinely trying to help but whose information, upon investigation, turns out to be irrelevant, people who are not trying to help at all, like the California man who tried to exploit the situation for financial gain. Every single piece of information that comes in has to be evaluated. Every claim has to be assessed against what investigators already know. Every lead has to be pursued or eliminated. In a case where the investigation is racing against the uncertainty of a victim's safety and a ransom deadline, the volume of incoming information is both a resource and a burden. For Savannah Guthrie, the experience of this investigation has been one of the most publicly documented personal crises any prominent journalist has ever had to navigate, and it has played out in a media environment that her very career has helped shape. She stepped away from her NBC duties, including what would have been her role in covering the opening ceremonies of the 2026 Winter Olympics, to be present and active in the search for her mother. The Winter Olympics coverage is one of the most significant broadcasting events of a 4-year cycle, and Savannah's absence from that assignment speaks to the severity of what her family was facing. This was not a choice made lightly. This was the choice of someone whose mother's life was more important than any professional commitment, however significant. She made public statements. She released videos. She communicated directly, on camera, in front of the world, with whoever might be holding her mother. She stood with her siblings, visibly composed despite what must have been an unimaginable internal experience, and delivered messages that were clearly crafted with both emotional honesty and strategic intent. The February 4th video statement is worth examining in detail. Savannah appeared alongside her siblings Annie and Cameron. She addressed directly the person or people responsible for her mother's disappearance. She said, and I am quoting her directly, "We are aware of reports concerning a ransom letter. We are ready to talk. Please reach out to us." She also acknowledged, in what was clearly a carefully considered addition to the statement, the family's awareness of how easily voices and images can be manipulated in the current technological environment, making clear that they would need genuine confirmation, proof of life in unambiguous terms, before they could respond to demands with confidence that Nancy was alive and actually in the hands of whoever was making contact. That specific acknowledgement, the reference to voice and image manipulation, speaks directly to the technological realities of the moment we are living in. We are in an era where deepfake technology, voice cloning software, and AI-generated media have created a situation in which seeing and hearing are no longer sufficient for believing. A video purporting to show Nancy Guthrie saying she is alive and being held would not, on its own, be convincing proof of life. A voice recording could be fabricated. The family, guided almost certainly by law enforcement and by advisors with expertise in exactly these situations, was making clear that they understood this and that they would not simply accept any purported proof at face value. That level of sophistication in how a family communicates publicly in a ransom situation is not something that happens spontaneously. It reflects preparation, guidance, and a clear-eyed understanding of the landscape they were navigating. The February 7th video was the one that cut deepest for most people who watched it. Savannah said, "We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay. We will pay." There are 3 words in the entire English language that, in this context, carry more emotional weight than almost anything else a family could say publicly. They strip away every other consideration. They reduce an impossibly complex situation to its most essential human truth. We want our mother back. We will do what it takes. We will pay. The fact that Savannah Guthrie made that statement on camera, publicly, knowing it would be broadcast instantly to millions of people, tells you everything about where the family was in that moment. They had moved past the stage of strategic positioning. They were at the stage of pleading. And they were doing it in the most public way imaginable, using the one platform they had, Savannah's face on a screen, to make the most personal possible appeal. The ransom deadline of February 9th at 5 o'clock in the afternoon came and passed without any public announcement of resolution. That silence, that absence of news, is itself a form of news. It means that as of the time this video was recorded, the situation had not been resolved in a way that law enforcement or the family chose to announce publicly. Whether that means the deadline passed and negotiations continued, whether it means the deadline passed and something else happened, whether it means the situation evolved in a direction that required continued silence, these are things that the public record does not tell us. What the public record does tell us is that as of February 10, 2026, Nancy Guthrie had not been located. No arrests had been made in connection with her disappearance. The investigation remained active and ongoing, with the full resources of the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, and federal agencies continuing to work the case. The White House response to this case is a dimension that deserves some attention because federal resources being offered at the presidential level in a missing persons case, even one as high profile as this, is notable. President Trump personally called Savannah Guthrie on February 4th, following an interview she gave with NBC's Tom Lamas, to offer additional federal resources and to express hope for Nancy's safe recovery. The White House posted information about Nancy on official social media channels, urging the public to report any relevant information. In practical terms, what does a presidential offer of federal resources mean? It means that the full range of federal law enforcement and intelligence capabilities, to the extent they are relevant and applicable to this case, are being made available to support the investigation. It means that if there are bureaucratic or jurisdictional barriers to accessing certain information or certain tools, those barriers can potentially be removed at the highest level. It means that the message being sent to law enforcement at every level is that this case is a priority, that resources will not be a limiting factor, and that the full weight of the federal government is available to assist. For Savannah Guthrie, who spent years covering the White House in her career as a journalist, there is an almost incomprehensible strangeness to the experience of receiving that call. The journalist who asked tough questions of presidents, who moderated debates and covered administrations, now on the receiving end of a presidential call about her missing mother. The professional and the personal colliding in a way that must have been disorienting even in the middle of everything else she was managing. Now let us go back and sit with the central question of this investigation, because I want to be very specific about what the evidence as publicly reported tells us and what it does not. The sheriff's statement that this is not what it seems is a statement that has to be understood in context. It is not a statement made carelessly. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos is an experienced law enforcement professional leading a major investigation with national visibility. Every word he says publicly about this case is chosen deliberately, because every word he says publicly has the potential to affect the investigation, to affect the family, to affect whoever is responsible for Nancy's disappearance, and to affect the millions of people watching. When he says this is not what it seems, he is saying it because he believes it to be true, and because he believes it is appropriate to say it in a public forum. What might he mean? In the context of what has been reported publicly about this investigation, there are several possibilities. He might mean that the evidence points to someone known to Nancy, rather than an unknown actor, and that the kidnapping framing is not the complete picture of what this situation is. He might mean that the ransom notes, or some of them, have led investigators in a direction that raises questions about who actually has Nancy and what their relationship to her and her family is. He might mean that evidence recovered from the scene, evidence that has not been publicly disclosed, has changed the investigative picture in a fundamental way. He might mean that the digital forensics, the camera removal, the pacemaker app disconnection, the sequential disabling of the surveillance systems, points to a level of foreknowledge about Nancy's home and routines that narrows the field of possible perpetrators significantly. What he cannot mean, at least not in a way that investigators have made public, is that the case has been resolved. Because it has not been. The search of the Cioni home sits in the middle of all of this, not as an accusation, but as a fact. A fact that exists alongside Tommaso Cioni being the last known person to see Nancy alive. A fact that exists alongside the sheriff's statement that this is not what it seems. These are pieces of a picture that investigators are putting together in real time, and the responsible approach for anyone outside that investigation is to acknowledge the pieces, note the questions they raise, and resist the impulse to reach conclusions that the available evidence does not yet support. Because the truth is that in an active investigation of this kind, the publicly available information is always only a fraction of what investigators actually know. Law enforcement shares what it chooses to share, which is typically what advances the investigation, what might generate useful public tips, and what is necessary to address urgent safety concerns. The rest is held close because releasing it would compromise the very work being done to find Nancy and to identify and apprehend whoever is responsible for her disappearance. What we can say with confidence, based on the evidence that has been publicly reported, is this. Nancy Guthrie did not leave her home voluntarily. Something happened inside that house in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, that left physical evidence and that led experienced investigators to treat the scene as a crime scene from the first hours of their arrival. The removal of the doorbell camera was deliberate. The sequential disabling of the surveillance systems was deliberate. The window of time in which these things happened was narrow, and the events within that window tell a story of planning and intentionality. Someone knew enough about Nancy's home, her routines, and her surveillance systems to execute what happened that night. And the ransom communications that followed, whatever their ultimate authenticity, contained details specific enough that investigators took them seriously. The February 9th deadline has passed. The investigation is ongoing. And a woman who spent more than 50 years building a life in the Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona, who raised 3 children, who went to church every Sunday, who relied on her community and was relied upon by it, remains somewhere unknown. For her family, every hour of uncertainty is its own particular kind of anguish. The not knowing is its own dimension of suffering that exists in parallel to the fear and the grief and the desperate hope. You cannot grieve properly when you do not know. You cannot move forward when you do not know. You are suspended in a state of terrible waiting, holding simultaneously the hope that she is alive and the fear of what each passing hour might mean. Savannah Guthrie has shown, in front of the entire country, what it looks like to hold yourself together in the face of that kind of uncertainty. She has shown what it looks like to love someone that desperately and to fight for them that publicly and to set aside the professional identity that defines how the world sees you and to simply be a daughter who wants her mother home. Whatever the resolution of this case ultimately looks like, whatever the truth is about what happened in that house on the night of January 31st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie deserves to be remembered as a person, as a mother, as a woman who built something real and lasting in a desert community over 5 decades, as someone who loved her church, her children, her grandchildren, her independence, as someone whose life has value that exists entirely independent of the extraordinary circumstances that have now surrounded it. The investigation will continue. The evidence will continue to be processed and analyzed. The leads will continue to be followed. And somewhere in the work being done by the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI and the federal agencies supporting them, there are people working every available hour to find Nancy Guthrie and to answer the questions that this case has raised. If you have any information that could be relevant to this investigation, please contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI. Tips can be submitted directly to law enforcement, and in a case with this level of complexity, even information that seems minor or tangential to you could be the piece that changes the entire picture. Did you see something in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood on the night of January 31st or the early morning hours of February 1st? Did you notice something unusual? Did someone say something to you before or after the news broke that now seems worth reporting? Make that call. Send that tip. The investigators working this case need it. Nancy's family needs it. This investigation is ongoing and True Crime Vault will continue to follow it. If there are significant developments, if arrests are made, if Nancy is found, if the truth of what happened that night is publicly established, we will cover it here with the same depth and seriousness that we have brought to this initial investigation. Subscribe so you are here when those updates come. This story is not finished. If this case gave you something to think about, if it raised questions you are going to be sitting with, if it made you see this story in a different or deeper way, leave your thoughts in the comments below. What do you make of the sheriff's statement? What do you think the removal of the camera tells us? What do you believe the ransom communications say about who might be involved? The conversation in the comments section on this channel is always substantive, always serious, and always worth having. I want to hear your analysis. Make sure you are subscribed to True Crime Vault and that the notification bell is activated. New investigations drop every week, and every single one of them is given the full, serious, in-depth treatment that real cases and real people deserve. If you want to keep going right now, There is another investigation waiting for you on this channel. Click it and stay with us. These are not just stories. These are real people, real families, and real mysteries that deserve to be remembered with the gravity they carry. Nancy Guthrie is a real person. Her family's anguish is real. The people working to find her are real. And here at True Crime Vault, we do not stop until every case gets the attention it deserves. We will see you in the next investigation.